All right, welcome to the training you need to ensure you can effectively pass a silica audit. The OSHA respirable silica standard is not new. The newer, more stringent standards have been fully enforced in construction since 2017 and in general industry and maritime since 2018. If you're running a construction site, operating a manufacturing plant, managing a foundry, or overseeing public works crews, silica exposure is not hypothetical. It's real, and so is the liability tied to it. Even for public entities that may not fall directly under federal OSHA jurisdiction, exposure still carries serious consequences. State plans, insurance carriers, and civil attorneys don't just ignore respiratory illness. If an employee develops silicosis, lung cancer, COPD, or kidney disease, the question will not be whether OSHA issued a citation. The question will be whether the employer took reasonable documented steps to protect its workforce. And let's be clear about the financial stakes as well. It could be in the tens of thousands and even in the hundreds of thousands if the scenario is determined to be willful. So look, this training is about preparation. It's about understanding exactly how an inspector evaluates your operation and of course keeping your employees safe. So, as a reminder, silica dust is generated whenever materials like concrete, brick, block, stone, mortar, or ceramic are cut, ground, drilled, crushed, or blasted. These particles are at least 100 times smaller than beach sand. They are invisible to the naked eye, but once inhaled, they travel deep into the lungs and remain there. When a silica audit begins, the first determination is simply, is silica here? The inspector asks if employees are performing tasks that create foreseeable exposure. For construction and industrial operations, the answer is often yes. If cutting, drilling, grinding, blasting, or crushing occurs, exposure is foreseeable. If the operation truly does not involve silica containing materials, the standard may not apply, but most trades and production environments encounter it in some form. Once exposure is established, the inspector's next question is often the simplest. Are you following Table 1? For construction tasks, Table 1 matches 18 common activities, like using handheld power saws or jackhammers with specific engineering controls, usually water delivery systems or vacuum dust collectors. The critical detail here is that if you strictly follow Table 1, you are not required to measure worker exposure. You get a pass on the complex air sampling. However, this comes with a trap. You cannot kind of follow it. If the table requires a wet method and your tank is empty, or if you are performing a task not listed on the table, that exemption vanishes and you are immediately judged by the next steps. If you aren't using Table 1, or if you are in general industry, the inspector demands an exposure assessment. This is where many programs fail because of three specific pitfalls. First, you cannot rely on generic job titles. You must assess the exposure for each employee who may be exposed. Second, you must survive the current conditions check. If production lines have changed, ventilation systems have been modified, or work practices have shifted, older sampling data is likely invalid. An inspector will compare your documented assessment to what is actually occurring on the floor today, and if they don't match, your data is thrown out. Finally, you must be aware of the action level trap. If your data shows exposures below the action level of 25 micrograms, you are safe. But if you are below the limit yet still above the action level, you are technically compliant but still on the hook for periodic monitoring every 6 months. Regardless of whether you use Table 1 or air sampling, you must have a written exposure control plan. This document identifies the tasks that involve exposure and the methods used to protect workers, including restricting access to high exposure areas. But a plan on a shelf isn't enough. The standard requires you to designate a competent person to implement it. During an audit, the inspector will look you in the eye and ask, who is your competent person? If you can't point to a specific individual who has the authority to identify hazards and correct them immediately, you will be cited. If exposure remains high, regulators examine whether all feasible controls have been implemented. You cannot rely solely on respirators if you haven't tried to stop the dust first. This means implementing engineering controls such as water delivery systems to suppress dust at the source, local exhaust ventilation like vacuums, enclosed operator cabs with filtered air, or isolating the process entirely. It also means using work practice controls, which involve changing how the work is actually done, such as wetting down materials before disturbing them to minimize dust generation. Inspectors look for easy violations during the walk-around, and the biggest red flag is usually housekeeping. The standard generally prohibits dry sweeping silica dust, and you must use wet sweeping or HEPA filter vacuums instead. Furthermore, you cannot use compressed air to clean clothing or surfaces unless it is used in conjunction with a ventilation system that captures the dust. If an inspector sees a worker blowing concrete dust off their pants with an air hose or pushing a dry broom across the dusty floor, the audit is essentially over. You've already lost. If controls don't fully limit exposure, respiratory protection becomes necessary. But simply handing out N95s is not enough. You need a full program that verifies several key elements. You must ensure workers are wearing the correct type of respirator, like distinguishing between an N95 and, let's say, a half face, and that medical evaluations are on file before use. You also need documented proof that the mask actually fits the worker's face through fit testing, as well as records showing the worker has been trained to use and maintain it. Crucially, you must offer medical exams, including chest x-rays, to any worker required to wear a respirator for more than 30 days per year. If you have a crew member grinding concrete for 2 months straight wearing a mask, but you never offer them a medical exam, that is a violation. So look, surviving a Silica audit is not about scrambling when someone walks through the door. It's about building a defensible program every single day. It means knowing whether you are a Table 1 operation or if you need air sampling. It means ensuring your current conditions match your paperwork. It means banning dry sweeping, designating a competent person, and tracking those 30 days of respirator use. The strength of your program determines whether an inspection becomes routine or costly, and whether an illness becomes preventable or permanent. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.